Welcome back, friends. Welcome back to another edition of Questions for Corbett here on the 24th of May, 2022. I'm your host, James Corbett of CorbettReport.com, and we're going to dip into the mailbag today for a question that I received through the contact form on CorbettReport.com from Justin, who wrote, Hi, James. I'm having trouble with voluntarism, to put it succinctly. I am on your side with voluntary interaction away from the state. My problem is how to combat the entrenched narrative. To quote a YouTube commenter, that might be your first problem. To quote a YouTube commenter, when more and more restrictions on cigarette advertisements were put in place, there was a decline in the number of smokers. 42% of American adults smoked in the 60s. Then laws were passed that banned advertising cigarettes to children and near schools, advertising on TV, advertising on billboards, forced them to add warning labels, forced them to use plain packaging, etc. Now, 13% of American adults smoke. We need to put similar regulations on advertising of fast food, sugary cereals, sugary drinks, unhealthy snacks, etc. Force, need, force, regulate, force. With a result like this, how do I defend voluntarism? They seem to believe that the state provided them with a satisfactory result, thus adding validity to the existence of the state so they can continue to push for more force and violence against the free market. I don't know what to make of this, and examples like this conflict with my understanding that voluntary interaction is the goal that we should strive for. How do I combat narratives defending the state's actions? Is there any good literature that helps parse these nuanced situations, or provides counterexamples? I feel there are holes in my knowledge that have yet to be patched, and I'm having trouble with finding these answers. Thank you for everything you do, Justin. All right, Justin, thank you very much for that question. I know that you are not alone in having these types of questions or struggling with these issues. I'm sure every single statist, and I'm sure pretty much everyone in the world, is steeped in the statist system their whole lives and is probably a statist before they become a voluntarist or anarchist. So I'm sure everyone struggles with these types of questions and counterexamples and, well, what do I say to that? So thank you for sending in that question and allowing me the opportunity to parse that out a little. And you do ask also for any literature, any good literature that helps parse these nuanced situations or provides counterexamples. Well, coincidentally, I was just reading a book that was recently sent to me by a listener. It's called The Essence of Anarchy. It is by Richard Cox, and it is, I would say, about these types of issues, the fundamental questions about anarchy, voluntarism. Can life without a state coercive monopoly of violence government exist? How would that work? And how would we deal with this situation or that situation? So I will, of course, put the link into that book so that you can go and support Richard Cox and purchase the book and read through it yourself. I think it does answer some of these questions that you're struggling with here. But rather than just me reading passages from the book, why don't we bring Richard Cox on to talk about it? Richard, thank you for coming on today.
Thank you very much, James.
Well, first of all, since this is your first time on the Corbett Report, perhaps you can introduce yourself and just tell us a little bit about the work that you do.
Okay, yeah, so I've been a listener of the Corbett Report for longer than I can actually remember. It must go back into the noughties at least, and had been interested in these kind of themes. My sort of more official background is in Eastern spirituality and meditation, and I've been interested in that sort of co-rising of more geopolitical issues and have walked down both of those areas, and that's accumulated. And recently I've written a couple of books, one on the nature of conspiracy theory and this other one on anarchism, because I think that probably a lot of people who get into this kind of area think at some point, well, what's the solution to all this? If this greater level of darkness going on, is it some sort of direct democracy thing? And then there's a kind of a funneling out of ideas that don't seem to work, and a lot of us end up deciding that anarchism is the most morally justifiable and efficacious position.
Yes. So I would say that your book is kind of not a document of your process of going through and arriving at those conclusions, but you do talk a little bit about those types of objections and things that come up along the way, and the types of things that people think about when they're talking about non-coercive society. First of all, I guess let's just set the terms of what we're talking about today. What is anarchy in your definition?
Well, a reflection upon that was really part of what prompted me to write the book, because it's very much associated with, well, on one level, it's associated with chaos, okay, and disorder. And I think we can move past that pretty quickly. And on another level, I thought of it for a long time as being the absence of government, and I would talk about it as such. And often that would cause a breakdown in communications. People take a sense of security from some kind of government. And when I thought about this more, I thought, really, I could get more precise about that. Because you can have governance in your local football club, and they can set rules like, well, don't wear your muddy boots in the changing room. And that's not an oppressive, hierarchical, domineering system. That's just common sense. We can have structures and systems that we would recognize as being government-like. So really, anarchy, anarchos, means no rulers, which is a little bit different, because I don't think of the governing body of the football club as your ruler necessary. So I tried to center the book around a question of being a model based on consent or coercion. So anarchy, then, I'm taking it to mean no coerced relationships, only consensual relationships. And that's the purest kind of essence I could get to of it.
Right. No one's going to tell me not to wear my muddy cleats in the changing room, you oppressive... No, of course, yes, it is. If it's a voluntary relationship, I choose to be a part of this club, and this club has certain rules. All right, so let's, I mean, obviously that does sound nice in just sort of an abstract way, but when you start to get into the nitty-gritties of it, it can become a lot more difficult to think about. How would we do this without the ever-present threat of the government's gun pointed at people's heads? And you do tackle I think the largest issues in your book: education, healthcare, social security, these types of really bedrock issues. But let's talk specifically about what Justin's talking about, or more specifically what the YouTube intelligentsia are talking about. Restrictions on cigarette advertisements, reducing the number of smokers. Hey, great, awesome. So now let's have restrictions on advertising sugary drinks and sugary cereals and fast food and unhealthy snacks. And then maybe we can start to look for other things that we can ban advertising of. What's the problem with this if it gives us the results that we're looking for?
Well, I think it's worth just thinking about what Justin's asking. So on one level, Justin's asking about, well, what is the answer to this? How do I understand this for my own intellectual satisfaction? And there might be another question in there. So how do I relate to YouTube commenters and who are throwing these kind of points? And one answer to that could be is you don't get onto Odyssey or something. It's a higher level of interaction. And I mean that jokingly, but also seriously. You do encounter people who, of course, and you're talking to a brick wall. And I do think of talking about anarchism as being often akin to an act of cult deprogramming, rather than having a conversation where you're likely to meet an open-minded person. But just going back to the technicalities, I'm not, prior to anything, opposed to all kinds of regulation, like with the muddy boots. Or maybe you live in an apartment block which is all privately owned, and maybe a tobacco firm wants to advertise its products in the communal areas, and some residents might like that because they're going to get a bit of reduction in their rent, and some residents might know, I don't want my kids walking past tobacco advertisements. So if it went the other way and there's a restriction, I'm not opposed to that. I think that's entirely legitimate. I wouldn't want necessarily those kind of adverts around. It's when you have these illegitimate giant entities like states imposing these kind of regulations over a vast area, that's essentially coercive. They have no, and I'm making a distinction there because you can legitimately acquire through some sort of homesteading or transference the land for an apartment block, maybe for a housing estate, and run that with some level of communal kind of governorship. But the states don't legitimately acquire the land that they seek to govern, which means it's comparatively absolutely vast an area, covering a double-digit percentage of the Earth's surface in some cases, which just leads to chaos, because you can't set one rule in Washington, D.C. that applies throughout the entire United States, or one rule in Moscow that runs all the way to Vladivostok. It's bonkers. So the problems that's going to create, I think you alluded to it, James, that where's it going to stop then? And I think you could just turn around and put this back on the YouTube commenter. Well, do you see any problems with this? And in the book I wrote, I think there's like 140 odd question marks, because I wanted it to be like a conversation where I'm encouraging the reader, the YouTube commenter in this case, to think about, to examine their own positions. What could be the problems with that? Is it going to move to alcohol? Are we going to have those, when you go into the pub for your pint of beer, are we going to have the kind of images that you see on cigarette packets of people dying of throat cancer? Is that going to be someone dying of alcoholism on every beer pump now? What about horse riding? Okay, that's pretty dangerous. Should we have pictures of people with broken necks on horse saddles? Or doesn't this all really play in? If we allow the government the right to do this, doesn't that just then create the war on drugs and the associated massive surge of crime? And ultimately, aren't we saying, given the right circumstances, the government has the right to put me under house arrest for an indefinite period if there's maybe a virus, maybe not, who knows? So there's one thing would be a runaway effect. If we don't know it. Another thing would be the YouTube commentator has, I would suggest, not parsed out the difference between correlation and causality. Okay, so there's a drop in smoking over the time, which coincides with government policies. It might really be appealing to think those government policies caused that drop, but you see comparisons between different countries. Like Canada introduced the pictures of the cancers on cigarette packets, and lo and behold, over the next 10 years, the rate of teen smoking went down. But it went down in the United States at a comparable rate, and they didn't have those images. So that's another factor. And it's especially when you run these experiments over giant areas, it's very, very hard to have a control group. It's not like the advantage of anarchism is a lot of pluralism in anarchy, everyone trying their own thing. And you might have come in some point there, but I would say the other major thing, James, when talking about regulation is what's known as the Peltzman effect from the economist Sam Peltzman. Are you familiar?
I am not. It doesn't even ring a bell.
Okay. Well, you've probably seen, I think a lot of the audience will have seen, the go-to example for the benefits of government-forced regulation is compulsory seatbelt laws. And there's kind of a narrative that, oh, everyone knows now that was a good idea. And the only people that resisted that were kind of southern redneck hicks who were ranting and raving about their liberty being offended and their right to put themselves and other people at risk by not wearing seatbelts. And all the sensible people, all the clever people, all the people with an ounce of common sense fully support the state imposing seatbelt mandates. And I'm not sure if I was left in a room by myself to think about this issue that I would see what the problem could be with that. I'd have, oh yeah, that's challenging. You know, what could, I mean, it does seem like a good, other than maybe a runaway effect, that there's no kind of bad to that. Well, the economist Sam Peltzman from the University of Chicago analyzed the effect these regulations had, the compulsory seatbelt regulations, compared to what they were supposed to have. They were supposed to bring a 20% drop in the death rate in fatalities and car accidents. And he found that he couldn't find anything after 10 years. Nothing. There just didn't seem to be any drop in fatalities. There seemed to be more accidents going on, and this really puzzled him. And what he concluded was, looking at it through the lens of an economist, that essentially people kind of like to drive a bit faster than they should. People like to drive a bit recklessly. People like to overtake and get on and get home as wherever they could. And if you make a car safer, you're essentially lowering the costs of that. So in economic thinking, what happens when you lower the cost of something? People buy more of it. So people started driving fractionally more recklessly. And there were less driver fatalities, but more overall accidents. And more, for all the drivers that didn't die, now pedestrians and cyclists did. So even the most obvious regulation, well, that one must be a good, has these unintended consequences.
That makes a lot of sense, and I'll just put it in a framework that Canadians can understand. Yeah, it's like when every hockey player wasn't wearing a helmet and a lot of padding. You're going to play a little differently than once you get all of that padding in place and you feel more secure, then you're going to play a lot more violently, I suppose, because you're less concerned about the repercussions of that. And so that does make a certain amount of sense. I will echo what you say in that I think let me organize my thoughts because you put a lot on the table there. Okay, I think one of the ways that maybe one of the base things that we should address is, yes, what layer or which way is Justin directing this question? Is this really can I improve my argumentation against people who are asking for, challenge me on this, or am I trying to prove it for myself? Are you asking this question, like, does this make sense? Maybe it is better. If that's the case, then of course the answer is going to be quite different. Because I would say the utilitarian argument does not appeal to me at all. Oh, well, we can, even if it were true, even if we just took it at face value, we can achieve a percentage drop in this or that activity by instituting this threat of violence against you if you choose to do this activity. I don't think that's, I still wouldn't take that trade-off. I think it's, for me, it's about the principle, but I understand there are other people who are wired differently and who do think that the utilitarian results are what we should go by. Having said that, then who gets to choose, exactly, who gets to choose which standards or which activities or which things we should be concentrating on and what results we should be striving for with regard to that? I'm sure a lot of people, not everyone, but a lot of people would say, yes, reducing smoking rates or something is overall for the good. But what about when we do get into more controversial areas? Okay, so now we're going to start controlling what people eat. And we have decided that these foods are contributory to bad health outcomes, which are defined as this. And so we will start banning advertising of those foods or slapping warning labels. But then, well, what about other types of health outcomes? Or what if somebody got into power one day who decided, there'd be a lot less sexual transmitted disease and infections if we just outlawed sex before marriage? Or imagine, again, take it to the reductio ad absurdum. It would be safer if everyone were just locked in a padded room their entire life and let out once an hour or 1 hour a day for exercise or something along those lines. The results for overall health would be fantastic, guys, as measured by us. So that's the way that I start approaching this question is, yes, exactly, reductio ad absurdum, who gets to decide and under what way? And then what say do we have if we decide that, maybe I don't agree with this. Maybe this is going in the wrong direction. Then is this a voluntary thing in which I can say, well, no, I don't want to choose to abide by those rules. So these are the types of issues that get dredged up in my mind when I'm confronting this question. Do you have anything that you'd like to respond to with regard to that?
Well, I think the reductio ad absurdum is already here. It's not in the abstract. It's in the real world. So another area that Sam Peltzman investigated, not one I wrote about in the book, but I picked up on the work of Dr. Mary Ruitt, a research scientist, was on the effects of regulation in medicine and the role the FDA plays, the Food and Drug Administration in the US, on being the sole regulator, taking responsibility for the passing or failing of all drugs. And again, on the face of it, sounds like a good idea. Government agency, not subject to corruptible market forces, could make this dispassionate judgment on drugs. And it tends to be quite conservative because the incentives are that the FDA people will potentially get in trouble if they release a drug that goes and kills thousands of people, will not get in trouble for holding it back. So that, again, sounds like that's the way you'd want it. What Dr. Mary Ruitt, who was also a famous libertarian as well as a research scientist, calculated was that the delay time on releasing drugs and causing retarding medical innovations had lowered the life expectancy of every American by 5 years from around the 1970s onwards. And that's just incredible because no one knows about that. No one even thinks that. No one thinks I'm going to live 5 years less because of the FDA. And even, if pharmaceutical drugs aren't your thing, even to the point of restricting how doctors could talk about folic acid and recommending it for pregnant women. Dr. Ruitt estimated that was as bad as the thalidomide scandal in Europe, the prevention of that. So we've already hit the reductio ad absurdum. It's right out there in society through this kind of state regulation.
An incredibly
when
important
you have a coercive institution.
Yeah. I think, again, this is a difficult concept for people to get their mind around because of the seen and the not seen. And it's easier to know what we can see rather than those sorts of things that are the abstract of the control group that doesn't exist kind of thing. If people want to approach this in a different manner, I would suggest they check out my film literature in the New World Order on Upton Sinclair's The Jungle, talking about what ultimately led to the formation of the FDA and how that ultimately leads to less safe products and also the cartelization of industries like meatpacking that Sinclair was supposedly concerned about in the first place. So, again, it's an incredibly important point to understand there, but it's so much easier. It's so much easier to argue from that YouTube commenter's perspective because, again, it's you can see it, you can put your fingers on it, correlation, causation, whatever. There's a statistical drop, and look, governments can come in and act, and it'll help solve problems. And I think that's kind of the appeal of sadism at its base. I want to accomplish this. I can't do it. I can't make everyone do it, but the government can. So we need a government to come in and do what I want it to do to the population. It's a very appealing thing. I guess this goes to the other level of this. Is there any convincing of people, statists who are not open-minded, shall we say, on this topic? Is there any way to actually convince them of this? Or is this something that that we will always have to deal with, is that a large portion of the public just don't want to approach these issues?
Just to speak to the point you made there, James, it's a very easy argument. Of course, it's kind of a non-argument, because if I wrote a book from that perspective, I could have done it in a day. Just every chapter would say the government should regulate this more. Every chapter just hit it with a hammer, and it's so it requires no. Now, I think that anarchists or people trying to debate from an anarchist position can put too much pressure on themselves sometimes, in that the world is full of complex problems that I don't have a clue about. I don't have a clue how to solve addiction issues. I don't have a clue whether all these different schemes would work, about preventions of advertising, or whether they're just total bunk and it has no effect. And anarchism is not a little box that you drop a complex problem into, pull a lever, and a perfect solution comes out. If I had a box like that, we wouldn't need anarchism, because I could just tell everyone what to do. It'd be great. But that's not what it is. It's the recognition that there is a morality which we should take consistently. We shouldn't say, okay, don't steal except for the government. That's fine. The same morality is consistent for society, and then it's an examination of the consequences of coercive action, and think, well, that's probably a really bad way to solve the problem. That's going to have all sorts of unintended consequences. And then to come on to your question, James, about this, I was surprised. I don't think that I had a kind of emotional attachment to the state. I might have had emotional attachments to other things in life, but when I saw the logic of anarchism step by step, and I arrived at that position, it just seemed like, okay, great. I never really wanted this thing associated. It always seemed like a pretty bad idea to me. And then I was surprised to encounter people who it would be really seem to touch a nerve of them when you criticize the state, and they have a strong attachment to it. And we're all kind of raised by the state in the schooling system. So I came to see conversations about this as really being akin to a kind of cult deprogramming. And that's why I quote in the last chapter, I open it up with a quote by Megan Phelps Roper, who was in the infamous Westboro Baptist Church, and they're raised from childhood onwards to protest the funerals of soldiers and anyone they consider to be deplorable in society, and they have this extreme Christian theology. And she talks in the book about how she stepped out of that, how she came to see the contradictions into it, and the kind of experiences that led her to that. And I find that very interesting to employ that kind of thinking about when talking to people about the state. It won't work. There are people that will be committed to their grave to statism, but what I found is more helpful is to ask questions that get them to examine their own positions. And they probably won't do it while you're standing there, but the more honest of them might wake up at 3 a.m. and go, darn it, he had a point there, actually. I didn't have a good answer to that. And you want to make people troubled in their own mind. Yeah. Very nicely, just leave something that troubles them.
Yeah, exactly right. I think all of the profound changes in consciousness probably happen at 3 a.m. Actually. And if we really want to psychoanalyze statism itself, I would say that the family, the state as a substitute or some sort of stand-in for the family structure is not just an analogy. I think it really plays on fundamental human sort of interactions and social formations, to the point where, even things like left, right, nanny state versus law and order state is mummy government, daddy government. When you attack that paradigm altogether, I think some people take it as an attack on their family. And I think they probably psychologically defend against it in a similar way. So it is a needlessly touchy subject. We should just be arguing about, well, how should society function? But of course, people are deeply invested in the types of structures that they've become involved in. And then, of course, there's a large portion of the public whose paycheck depends on some way in the state. So at any rate, there's a lot of issues here. I think we've broached some of the major points here. And for more detailed thoughts about how do we approach non-coercive government-like structures or free market-like structures, and what do they mean? What would they look like? I would suggest people do check out The Essence of Anarchy. Once again, the link will be in the show notes. But finally today, let's talk a little bit about the other work you do. Tell us about your Deep State Consciousness podcast.
Yeah, I kind of fell into podcasting because I had some interesting friends and I thought they should be interviewed. And for a long time I didn't do it because I didn't think I could get anything original from them. And then I found how amazing it is that when two people sit together, the interaction brings all sorts of originality to the surface. And I found I quite liked it. So I found more people to interview. And then I started doing my own stuff. So it's obviously the deep state consciousness is like the consciousness thing comes from my sort of background interest in spirituality and philosophy around consciousness, and then deep state was way before the term became, you can imagine how horrified I was when that became adopted by the Trumpisms. So that was why I was reading Peter Dale Scott years ago, and this concept where he contrasted a classical conspiracy theory. We have one center of power to a deep state where there's movement in the depths that is clearly affecting the surface and controlling it, but you can't quite say what it is. And I thought that was a nice thing to also then take into a sense of spirituality that we perhaps shouldn't have, to break free of some of the dogmas in that and the assumptions we might make. So it was a combination of those two things. And so I do stuff around consciousness and exploring that. And I've just written another book on the philosophy of conspiracy theory, looking at the ways that conspiracy theory is used in all sorts of ways, how it obviously has this effect of tearing down societal structures, but also perversely props them up. Like the Rachel Maddows and Sean Hannitys of the world will get their favoured tinfoil hat wearing conspiracy theorist on to talk about 9/11 and the not only the planes but the Twin Towers being holograms or something, and that way everyone's okay, you can all go back to sleep now, audience, that they're crazy, carry on. Isn't that weird? They have these, so just in little philosophical insights, and maybe of interest to your audience, James. I'm doing a podcast series at the minute, which I've titled The Energy of Empire, and I'm picking up on the US empire as it stepped overseas during the Roosevelt presidency in the 1890s, and they subdued the Indians at that point and went off to the Philippines and Cuba and all these different places. And then that's just on that in series 1, and now I'm looking more at the British running into World War One and this concept of an Anglo-American establishment and how these things came together. And ultimately, this will be a long time, looking at how we've arrived in a world where 10 years from now we'll own nothing and apparently be happy. Like, where did all that come from? So I'm trying to satisfy my own curiosities there.
Excellent. Well, I will hope that already some Corbett Reporteers are tuned in and clued into your podcast, because I did include a link to Energy of Empire number 8 on Panama in a recent newsletter. I also included a few months back in recommended listening of a newsletter a link to your Contradictions in Left Anti-Imperialism podcast, which I very much appreciated that one. I thought that was a really nice way of encapsulating it. So I hope people will check it out. Check out the work that you're doing generally. Check out this book. And, also I hope this spurs some conversation about anarchism and what it is that we're even attempting to prove, and to whom and under what circumstances and for what reasons, which may be the base level of this question. I think we'll leave it there for today. Richard Cox, thank you very much for your time.
Thank you very much, James.